We need to know how knowledge is being construed in order to ask more ethical questions. What do we do with the knowledge? Who has access to the knowledge? Who is producing the knowledge? In which purpose? What is there any hidden agenda of the way that knowledge is being funded and the research is being funded? It's like, and you mix it up, and the idea is that both branches, both lines of questioning are extremely relevant in themselves and with one another.
Welcome to Idioms of Normality on Future Framed TV, the collective podcast series of Traces&Dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Mason, and I'm joined here today with Dr. Fanny Verrax. Bonjour et bienvenue sur les Idioms de Normalité.
Merci, Paul.
Really fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being ready to spend your time chatting with me.
It's a pleasure.
Now, tell us a little bit about you.
Okay, I'm a philosopher by training. I'm fully born and raised in France. But I made a slightly different choice when it comes to philosophy. That is that in France, we have this really heavy tradition of continental philosophy. So that means mostly German and French philosophers. And when you go to university to study philosophy, that's mostly what you do. And for my master's, I actually chose the only master's program in France that does analytical philosophy. So that is philosophy mostly influenced by British and American philosophers. And it's actually quite rare, and there is this sort of absurd controversy about which kind of philosophy is more legitimate or more operational. And I like them both. I think they're both, useful and interesting. But so I'm French, and I have this like heavily French and German philosophers background for like my bachelor's, and like I was born into that, and I read extensively Plato and Aristotle and everything like that. But for my master's, I did this. I was mostly influenced, and then for the last 15 years, I've been mostly influenced by American and English-speaking philosophers and political scientists.
This is blowing my mind because when I look at your CV, I'm like, oh, she's an engineer. Oh, she's a scientist. But really, your base training has been in philosophy.
And like very traditional philosophy.
Fantastic. And this has taken you through to weird and wonderful areas, working on rare minerals, radioactive waste, and what I want to get into later, post-normal science. This sounds amazing. Before we get into that, let me hit off with the first question. Fanny, what is normal?
The funny thing is I actually taught a class on what is normal a few years ago. For engineering school students, okay? And when I started the class and I asked them what is normal, they often thought about very engineering examples, sort of what is a normal concrete, or what is sort of a normal kind of material to build something. And they actually had a class right after mine that was called concrete pathologies, like the pathologies of concrete, the material. And I didn't know that was a thing. And there was like, well, normal concrete, you can build with it, but like a concrete with pathologies is not normal, and then you kind of do something with it. So they had a very operational definition of what is normal. Normal is you can work with it. Abnormal or pathological is you cannot work with it. You have to fix it in order to be able to build with it.
Wow.
So we started like that, and I thought that was really fascinating. And then I made this booklet for them that is like maybe 20 pages booklet with a lot of extracts from philosophers, political scientists, sociologists, obviously Canguilhem, the French philosopher Canguilhem, who wrote the book Le Normal et le Pathologique, about how a biological norm has transformed into a social norm. So then they sort of expanded their horizon on what is normal beyond normal of concrete.
I want a copy of this booklet. Like, this sounds like a great class. I want to be one of these, and it would be so fascinating to be in a class with people who are going, pathological concrete is concrete that you can't do anything with. And what a fascinating way to think about normality, because from an engineering perspective, and when I think about normality and the metaphor of normality being engineered, I can very much see that this is a concept which is used to turn people into something you can do something with. If you foster the idea that there are normal people in a population and there are pathological people in a population that you cannot do anything with, that speaks very strongly to me.
Absolutely. I'm not sure they perceive the irony of what they were saying, but I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Tell me more about this course. I mean, where did you take them? Where did you lead them?
So the idea was to go from biological norm to statistical norm to legal norm, and we also talked about legal norms and what does it mean that it is a norm and not a law, and the normative aspect of lawmaking. Basically, there's this idea that the law is not necessarily made to be entirely respected, but to influence norms, so that if something is illegal, the thing right underneath is not quite normal. It's not illegal, but you're so close to breaking the law that it becomes not quite normal in terms of social norms. And I really like that idea.
It's fascinating that who are those legal norms for then? Are they for the wider population? Are they for the masses?
Okay, for instance, we had a very controversial law that was passed in France a couple of years ago to forbid spanking children. Okay. And then the question can be, okay, but who is going to enforce that law? I mean, are you going to have police officers, circling at night into houses to see if maybe children have been spanked? Of course not. So obviously, I mean, if the spanking is like really regular and heavy, then it becomes child abuse, and there will be some reporting, hopefully, at some point. But otherwise, the idea is that you can't really enforce that law. You can't really have monitoring of that law. But the idea is that you say, okay, this is the law, so this is the new social norm. No physical violence towards children. And of course, some parents are still going to spank their children a little bit, but they know, since the law has changed, that the norm has changed.
Yeah, very strongly it talks about it prompts self-surveillance about your own behavior and behavior behind closed doors, doesn't it? So you've taught this unit on what is normal. You've had this incredibly varied career, and then somehow you end up working with this group who call themselves post-normal scientists.
Yeah.
What is post-normal science?
Okay, so there is a very clear definition, paradoxically, of what is post-normal science, because it has to meet 4 criteria. Okay, so post-normal science has been defined in contrast, in opposition to normal science as defined by Thomas Kuhn, right? The revolution of the scientific revolutions. And so the idea is that normal science can operate in a space when we know really stuff, we understand stuff. And the idea is that nowadays, in many different scientific fields, we don't know that much, and the stakes are super high. So the 4 criteria to talk about post-normal science are: 1, uncertainties are high. You have high uncertainties, which means that the role of the expert has to evolve. It's not just about getting the best expert in town. It's
you have high
uncertainties.
Uncertainties. Okay.
Sorry about my Australian accent.
I think I'm being teased here. So in the context of high uncertainties, experts have to be very fast adapting.
No. The idea is that the uncertainties are so high that it's not just about getting the best expertise, but perhaps changing our views on expertise. So, for instance, perhaps doing some kind of participatory science involving citizens, because maybe we need other types of knowledge and not just the best expertise knowledge, because it is not enough. So that is the first criterion. The second criterion is stakes are high. Okay. So it is not just, so a typical example would be maybe for an astronomer, you can have really high uncertainties about whether this kind of star or constellation is like, I don't know how many million light years apart or something like that. And you can have a scientific controversy. But you don't have very high stakes, okay? It doesn't really matter to society nowadays whether the star is 2 billion years or whatever. So this is why astronomy, for instance, would have high uncertainties but very low stakes. So it's not post-normal science. Dealing about or working on nuclear power and nuclear waste, that would typically be a post-normal issue because you have very high uncertainties and very high stakes. And this is a third criterion, future generations are involved, so that the decisions you are making now are affecting future generations.
Living future generations?
Both.
So unborn future generations as well are factored into the design of these research questions.
Yeah.
That's great.
Then the fourth, I'm sorry, I didn't actually say it in the right order, but then the fourth criterion is values are in dispute. So even with the best experts in town and maybe some kind of participatory science, people might not agree about what should be done. So when you look at it like that, you realize that there are many, many fields of policy making and public decision making and private decision making that actually enter that field because we don't know that much and the stakes are super high and we don't really agree on what kind of values should be followed, and future generations are involved.
I realize that I've been working the last few years in post-normal science. So thank you for telling me the research field that I've been sort of finding myself embedded in, but not knowing others. What kinds of projects are people working on in post-normal science? Knowingly working on, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, post-normal science is both a theoretical framework and an operational framework. Okay, so at the time, I did my PhD in Norway, in Bergen, the city of Bergen, and it was a center called the Center for Vitenskapsteori in Norwegian. So that means the Center for the study of the sciences and the humanities, which doesn't mean much because it's like so global, so vast. But a lot of people at that time were doing either their PhD or postdoc or research project, trying to apply the post-normal science theoretical framework to a specific kind of disciplinary field. Okay, so like what would it mean? What would it produce to take a post-normal look to nutrition studies or to environmental studies or to okay, so we had a lot of people who had a double skill. So like there were philosophers and doctors, philosophers and mathematicians, philosophers and economists, etc., and they would apply the post-normal science framework to another disciplinary field, and that was made it so fertile.
And always philosophy and something else, or
most of the time, yes. Most of the time, yes. My very own PhD supervisor, he was a biochemist by training, and then he added some lines to his resume, and he became a philosopher. So it was like philosopher and biochemist. In my case, I had 2 master's degrees, one in philosophy and the other one in economics, ecological economics. So I was doing philosophy and ecological economics.
All right, hang on. What is ecological economics?
So there is a major difference that often the medias don't really comprehend between environmental economics and ecological economics, and it's really not the same. Environmental economics has an objective to measure, quantify, for instance, the services that the ecosystems are providing us, okay? And then it's actually quite useful in terms of policy making because you can say, look, you want to, I'm going to take a very caricatural example here. Look, you want to destroy this forest to make a new shopping center, whatever, and you are doing that as the mayor because you think you will get, I don't know, let's say 1 million in tax revenue per year. Okay, let's just take a very smooth number. Now, environmental economics would say, okay, but what is this forest providing to your citizens? It is providing, depending on the country, it might be providing wood to heat, burning wood.
Firewood, yep.
Firewood. It might be providing recreational use, spiritual use. Maybe it's somewhere where children are learning about, I don't know, mushrooms and birds, and maybe it's a birds reserve, whatever. And so I'm not going to give any more examples because I think I forgot the most obvious ones, but you see the point. And then you quantify all of that, and you're like, actually, if nature was giving you the bill, it gives you much more than $1 million. So you should really keep the forest because it's giving you so much more. This is what environmental economics is doing. And I'm not saying it's not good. I think it's going to be extremely useful. I think it has helped preserve some ecosystems. So it has definitely a very valid use of environmental economics. Now, after some years, some people have started saying, oh, but come on, can we really, and this is the title of a very seminal, famous paper, how much is worth the song of a songbird? Can you really put a price on that? And is it possible to compare all of those things? And then ecological economics say, we cannot measure, we cannot quantify, we do not want to give a monetary amount for the forest. What we want to do is gather people together, people who are interested in the forest, who are stakeholders of the forest for some reason, and they decide within sometimes a post-normal science framework, which is like, what are the uncertainties about the forest and what are the stakes and how will it affect future generations and what are our values in dispute? Maybe for some people, the forest has some kind of spiritual value, for instance, and not for others. And how do you deal with that without quantifying it? So that's the main difference between ecological economics and environmental economics.
Yeah, my fear as you were talking about environmental economics was that we start commodifying things like air and water. Oxygen suddenly becomes commodified because, and then we go down a rabbit hole of Nestle saying that water is not a basic human right, whereas the ecological economics model takes not just numbers and monetary figures into account, but takes into account perspectives. Does it ever take into account multi-species perspectives? Like, do you ever envisage the birds as stakeholders?
Definitely, yes. That is the whole point.
So I can see how this is both theoretical and operational, because it's a theoretical exercise to imagine a bird as a stakeholder in ecological economics, but it is operationalized by then translating that into policy, legislation, decision-making, urban planning, etc.
Ecological economics per se is a very stimulating field theoretically, but it is rarely applied directly in policymaking. That's just to confirm what you were saying.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So masters in philosophy, masters in ecological economics, and then somehow you found yourself surrounded in a room of people working in post-normal science.
Yeah.
And thank you for giving us a lovely definition of what post-normal science is. But how did you end up in that room?
I could tell a beautiful story, and you know what? I'm going to do just that. So there is this guy that I really like, and his name is Silvio Fruntovich. I think he's from Argentine, originally. And then his family flew South America, came to Europe, and he met with Jerry Ravetz, who is a British mathematician. And together, they sort of created the framework of post-normal science. I was lucky enough to meet him multiple times in Bergen and in Barcelona and various cities where we had conferences. And he had this capacity to apply the post-normal science framework to virtually any relevant issue.
Applying post-normal science to almost any topic, not to arrive at a particular answer, but to engage in process. Unpack that for us.
One thing, it's not to apply to any topic, but any topic of relevance, and to realize that in policy making, this is really a tool for, theoretically for any people involved in social and human sciences, but at the policymaking level, to realize that most environmental issues, most bioethical issues, most global health issues can be and should be at least temporarily treated and looked at with this framework in mind, not necessarily as the definitive answer, but as a framework that, at the very least, might prevent you from having any blind spots. That's one of the interests of the approach.
Yeah, right. And it slows things down a bit too. It sounds like it gives more room to brainstorm alternative approaches and perhaps different paradigms.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the thing is, so postnormal science is the overarching theoretical framework, but then you have tools. You don't have to use them; they're just the tools. Okay. One of the tools is the deliberation matrix, which was actually partly designed at the University of Versailles-Saint-Quentin in France, where I did my master's degree in ecological economics. And so the deliberation matrix is actually a very simple tool. You have, on one axis, you have what are the issues at stake. So you write down the issues, okay? Employment, health, whatever, okay, all of the issues, okay? And then on the other axis, you write down all of the stakeholders. And then you can actually either do it in a very top-down approach, and the same person is thinking, okay, what is how does the employment issue pan out for this specific community who is within the stakeholders? Or you can actually gather people together, and this specific community can have a representative that tells you what their issues are or what is at stake for them with the employment issue or health issue or pollution issue or whatever. And the deliberation matrix is actually, I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds so simple, but it's actually rarely really put in practice when actual policymaking and decision making is being made. And this is something I have used. So I worked as a freelance consultant, I worked for 3 years for the French Ministry of Environment. And I did several rounds of the deliberation matrix around the topic of climate justice, for instance. And that was really fascinating because, first of all, it means that people who are very used to think about some specific issues with their own perspective, and they have to think, okay, what are the issues of climate justice for a homeless person? What are the issues of climate justice for someone who lives up in the mountain? It requires a lot of imagination, but also empathy to think about how these issues, and it slows down the process. You're absolutely right. But I think that's a really good idea, because when it comes to environmental issues, which is my main field of study and interest and anxiety as a person, it looks like we didn't do much for years and we didn't think about it so much. And then we're like, oh, but now it's so urgent, we can't really take the time to think. So beforehand, we didn't think because we didn't think it was important. And now we don't take the time because it's too urgent. So when do we think? Like, when is the thinking happening? And the postnormal science framework actually allows for that space.
I just want to sign up in your next course. I want to learn this deliberation matrix because it sounds like a really useful tool for putting a bit of a gap between action and reaction and becoming aware of the biases that perhaps are perpetuating some of the problem. Sometimes we try and put together solutions that actually perpetuate the very paradigm that, I mean, I think Michel Foucault pointed this out, that you can try and push back against the problem, but in pushing back against the problem, you're perpetuating it. There's things rippling through my brain right now as we're talking and making me rethink some of the cultural engagement work that I've seen done in places like Australia and New Zealand. And an interesting reaction, for example, and let's just look at this as a philosophical object for a moment, or an ethnographic object, as an anthropologist. A reaction often to engagement, for example, with Indigenous populations is, it's going to take so much time. And the interesting thing here is that the productivist, consumerist mindset says we need to do. We need to act. We need to do. if you're constantly thinking about what do I need to do, how do I need to act, then you're not considering alternative ontologies. You're not considering alternative ways of being that are probably or possibly more environmentally friendly, possibly much more ecologically sustainable. And, by not doing something, sometimes you're actually being friendlier to the rest of nature. Sometimes I think back to that Russian submarine off the coast of Cuba who didn't follow orders and didn't fire a missile and averted a war. By not doing something, that's sometimes much more important than the action that you take. I mean, I'm really excited by this thing called post-normal science. I'm also interested about where we go to from here. And the question here, sometimes I ask people, what questions should we ask about normality? But in this instance, I want to ask, what questions should we ask about post-normal science? Does it challenge the science that has come before it? I get this sensation that post-normal science is it a reaction to normal science, or is that just a title that gives it a brand?
Yeah, it is definitely a reaction to normal science, and I mean most people involved in that field, they're philosophers of science or STS scholars, science and technology studies scholars. Another way of saying it is that within philosophy of science, usually, or within science and technology studies, you have two main branches, right? You have epistemology. How is knowledge construed and built, and you have ethics. What do you do with knowledge? Okay, and very often people specialize either in one or the other. It is quite. I mean, it happens, but it's not the most common to have people who are heavily involved both in the epistemology questions and the ethics questions. And postnormal science is a way also of bridging that, saying, well, we need to know how knowledge is being construed in order to ask more ethical questions. What do we do with the knowledge? Who has access to the knowledge? Who is producing the knowledge? In which purpose? What is there any hidden agenda of the way that knowledge is being funded and the research is being funded? And it's like, and you mix it up, and the idea is that both branches, both lines of questioning, are extremely relevant in themselves and with one another.
I can see here how post-normal science, in part, not in total, but in part, is a reaction to the normal science, because normal science has been dominated by white, educated, industrialized, democratic populations. In a previous interview with Elizabeth Stevens, for example, she talks about how how the word normal replaced white North American, and how the word normal almost one for one was erased this phrase white North American and just inserted a much more benign looking word that hid these hierarchies in populations, these very racist, discriminatory hierarchies. And when post-normal science is including more people in the conversation and bringing even non-human stakeholders to the table and giving them a voice, there's definitely a reaction to what could be called the normal science of the 20th century.
Interesting. Yeah.
So where to from here for Dr. Fanny Verrax?
I mean, okay, this is not something that I'm doing personally at the moment, but I guess I would find it dangerous to completely get rid of the idea of norm. And at the same time, I think it is essential to transform what it means in many fields. So how do you keep what's to be kept, while getting rid of everything that should really be written off? I mean, I think the notion of statistical norm, for instance, is quite important and useful in policy making. when you talk about, for instance, what is the norm for poverty? How do you define how someone's poor in order to maybe produce some relevant, useful policy making? Well, you have a statistical norm, and usually it's like half of the median income, for instance, or something like that. And that would be like the norm below which you are considered poor. And so how do you keep the usefulness of statistical norms in this area or others without making it a normative ontological norm, which is, oh, society has defined me to be poor? So I think that's a very interesting field.
That's an interesting point, that statistical methods have some usefulness, but we need to make sure that that usefulness doesn't bleed into cultural categories that become discriminatory or damaging to stereotype building or identity construction.
I think I'm gonna actually dare to give you a very personal anecdote here, and this relates also to how normal has been used in psychology. So when I think I was very young, I was about 17, and I went to see a psychologist. The reason why I wanted to go see a psychologist is because I wasn't feeling so well about myself. The reason my mother wanted me to go see a psychologist is because I was gay, and she had just found out, and she was very upset about it. And obviously you could say being gay is outside of the statistical norm. It is a minority. So in that aspect, I completely embrace the fact of being not normal, which is I am outside of the statistical norm. But of course, when people say gay people aren't normal, they don't just mean statistically, right? They mean something else. And this psychologist, I think she was trained with a psychoanalytic Freudian framework. So to her, gay people were not normal in another sense than just statistical. And she was since she belonged to a Freudian framework, she was very interested in like language, like Lacanian framework and language, and like dream analysis and stuff like that. And at that time, I was in college. I was a freshman, and I was preparing for an exam for, let's say, the equivalent of the Ivy League in France, let's say, something like that. And I was preparing to take that exam. And the name of the school, if I translate it, is École Normale Supérieure, which is Superior Normal School. It's the name of the school. And it was a very hard exam, and I was like studying a lot and talking to her about how hard it was to study for that exam. And at some point she said, do you think the reason why you want to enter that school so badly is because it's called Superior Normal School, and as a gay student, you don't feel quite normal, and you would like sort of to get back into normality thanks to by entering into that school? And I was fascinated because that's the name of the school. It happens to be the best school you can enter, so that a lot of kids want to, go there. And I was like, no, I don't think that's why. I think I want to go there because it's the best school. And so the reason why I'm telling you that story is because, again, I think the idea of normal can be quite useful, but you can really use it in wicked ways.
It seems like a really bad pun.
Yeah, a very, very bad very bad Lacanian pun. And so, since I'm very interested in the field of psychology at the moment, I would just want to say that I think there is a huge field ahead of us about how to help people who are not feeling well about their lives or themselves, who might be feeling like, also because they are outside of a certain norm. It can be a social norm or a sexual norm or a health norm or whatever. So without denying that the norm exists and that feeling outside of the norm can cause distress, but without making it a program to re-norm or to make it fit into a norm. And I think that's a very interesting program. And in that respect, that's why I'm so interested in the field of existential therapy by Irvin Yalom, among others. But it's the idea to not necessarily focus so heavily on the singularity of people who are outside the norms, but to focus on what makes us humans, and that is universal experiences: death, love, getting old, work. These are universal experiences. And if you focus on that, you focus much less on the norm and am I outside of the norm?
I think you distilled, and thank you for sharing that story. And I really hope that in the future, people don't have to live with that stupidity. I don't like calling people stupid, but that moment of, I really hope the future generations don't have to go through that kind of irritation and confusion. And one of the reasons that I am passionate about this series that I run is because the concept of normality can be so damaging on so many fronts. And I think it's really important to question it. I like the sentiment of not getting rid of it totally, because by leaving it there, we can question it. It gives us something to point our finger at. And in the absence of a word to describe something, it can sometimes be more difficult to point our finger at it. If that particular psychoanalyst had not made such a stupid comment, you wouldn't have something very palpable to point your finger at and say, hang on, that's epistemologically flawed, if not flawed on so many other ethical fronts as well. And I don't want to run away from this. I think I'm going to have to find someone I can interview about this, because you mentioned the École Normale Supérieure, the superior normal school. I mean, it's almost like an oxymoron, isn't it? The superior normal.
Absolutely.
I need to find someone who I can interview on the history of these normal schools. That's for sure.
Well, I can tell you just a little bit about it if you want.
Yeah, jump in.
So historically, with the Third Republic in France, which started in 1870, there was a massive ambition to get every kid in school for free. Okay, that was like the éducation publique laïque et gratuite. And so they created normal schools. And normal schools just meant the schools where the teachers are going to be trained, teachers for primary school. Okay, I think it was until 14 years old that school was planned. And then we needed a school to train the teachers who were going to train the teachers for primary school. So that's why you had École Normale, normal schools to train teachers for primary school, and École Normale Supérieure to train teachers who would teach at the normal school. So that's why it was called Normal Superior. That's the history. Now they don't do much of training. They don't train primary school teachers. That's not what they're doing now. But historically, that was their main job.
To normalize the population, to turn them into employees that they could do something with.
No, but definitely there was a huge ambition of normalization and language normalization, because before that, every region in France had their own dialects. And after this massive schooling, everyone is basically speaking the same French. I mean, we are one of the countries with the fewest discrepancies between regions in terms of language.
Fanny Verrax, I don't want to close you off because I'm finding it so fascinating to pick your brain. And thank you so much for your time. I feel like I could be asking you questions until next week, if not next month. Thank you so much for your time on our program. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have, because it's been truly enlightening.
I have very much so. Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to look at the other interviews, I think, after this one. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Please tell people to like, share, and follow.
Yeah, I will. Thank you so much.